Thank you for visiting amarpathshala.com. This lecture is part 2 from the chapter The Respiratory System. And in this lecture, we are going to discuss the gaseous exchange that happens in our respiratory system. Gas exchange. This term mainly defines the exchange or movement of gases from one place to another. Now, when it comes to our respiratory system, in part 1, we learned that the main organ wherein gas exchange occurs is our lungs, or more specifically inside our lungs there are tiny air sacs called alveoli. Now, what makes the alveoli so efficient for the exchange of gases, and exactly how does the exchange of these important respiratory gases happens? Well, let's find out. So guys, from part 1, we learned that alveoli are tiny air sacs found on bronchioles. Now, what makes these small pouch-like air sacs so efficient for gaseous exchange? If you were to isolate a bronchiole containing a couple of alveoli, you would see a picture that looks like this diagram. In this diagram, you can see a couple of tubes. In here, if you follow my cursor, you can see a blue tube, which is a branch of the pulmonary artery. Now, this artery chiefly supplies deoxygenated blood from our body to the lungs. Now, this blood comes directly from the heart, and this tube right here, the red one, is a branch of a pulmonary vein. Now, this vein supplies the oxygenated blood from the lungs to our heart. And in here, you can see a bronchiole on top of which there is wrapped smooth muscles. And all of these are kind of binding or networking or kind of forming a web of a network on each of those alveoli. So the alveoli are moist, thin-walled pockets which are the site of the gas exchange. They are, like I mentioned over and over in part 1 of this lecture, is that a respiratory surface chiefly has to be thin and then moist. So alveoli are thin-walled, moist, pocket-sized gas exchange sites. And what makes them moist is that on the wall of the alveoli there is a slightly oily surfactant. The name of the fluid is surfactant fluid, that which prevents the alveoli walls from collapsing on each other. Guys, we discussed in part 1 that in case of trachea, this collapsing on itself is prevented by the C-shaped rings of cartilage. And then in case of lungs, which is also a muscly flap, the collapsing on itself is prevented by a volume of air that is always present even after expiration, which we learn is known as residual volume. But in case of alveoli, how is that prevented? So we just learned that this collapse is prevented by the slightly oily surfactant fluid present on the wall of the alveoli. Now, gas exchange. See, exchange of gases is important because we need oxygen for our cellular respiration, i.e., if we have to break down the food that we digest and our cells absorb, we need something. We need a burning something that is able to burn, and oxygen gas is the chief burning or decomposing agent. So we need that gas to come inside our body, and we need to expel carbon dioxide. Why? Because for our body, it's a poisonous gas and we don't really need it. It is produced as a byproduct of respiration. So in this diagram, you can see that this is a cross-section of a capillary wall and the wall of an alveoli. In here, you can see that this is the oily surfactant fluid on the wall of the alveoli, and this is the alveolar epithelial cells, as in the cells that make up the wall of the alveoli. And then these are some connective fibers known as collagen fibers that is holding the alveoli wall together. and then on the opposite side are also capillary endothelial cells. These are the endothelial cells. These are the cells that make up the capillary walls that is surrounding the alveoli. And these are the site of the exchange. So as you can see here, the wall is extremely thin, you guys. Here you have the capillary endothelial cells making up the capillary wall. Here you have the blood cells, as in the blood that is present in the capillary. In here you have the collagen fibers and the capillary alveolar epithelium surfactant. That's basically the only thing that's making up the alveoli, and that's the only barrier between the blood in the capillary and the alveolus. So what's happening here is air entering the lungs definitely contains more oxygen than the air, or then it is present in blood. And in blood, the concentration of carbon dioxide is definitely more than that of the air entering inside the lungs. So how does these difference in concentration assist in the gas exchange? I'll tell you how. See, what happens here is that in this area, the alveolar region where we have the respiratory gases just breathed in as we inspire, in here the amount of oxygen is high, and in here the amount of carbon dioxide is high. As a result of which there forms a concentration gradient, which means that in here I have a lot of gas that is not here, and in here I have another lot of gas that is not here. So what happens is the carbon dioxide, which is high in this part, just moves across the border to that side, and the oxygen that is very high on this side just moves across the border to the other side. So it's like people crossing borders, but exactly the same number of people replacing each other. So in the end, there isn't usually any imbalance. So this is how the oxygen, which is high in the alveolar air, moves into the blood, and carbon dioxide, which is high in blood, moves into the alveolar region. You can see this is a single alveolus. This is a cross-section of a single alveolus. And the respiratory surface is made up of the alveoli and capillary walls. So the respiratory surface inside of the lung is all alveoli and capillary walls. This is where all of the gas exchange is happening. And in here you can see that blood is coming. See the blood, the cells are blue in here. Guys, the cells aren't actually blue. This is a mention or a denotation of how the cells are deoxygenated, and as they are passing through, they are getting oxygenated. If you were to actually cut open and see, you won't see red blood cells being blue, but it's just that these cells in here have more carbon dioxide. So therefore they are bluish in color. And so therefore they are colored in blue so that you can understand easily. So in an alveolus, blood first of all comes from the pulmonary artery supplied from the heart to the lungs. And excuse me, this blood, when it reaches the lungs, the artery divides into capillaries. And these capillaries forms a diverse network that surrounds each and every single alveolus. And as they do so, the blood, the deoxygenated blood from the pulmonary artery, then surrounds the alveolar wall like this. And as we breathe in, the inside of the alveolus is filled with more oxygen than carbon dioxide. And as a result, oxygen from the alveolus seeps into the blood cells that are surrounding it. And therefore, as it happens that when oxygen is seeping in, something has to come out. Something that is excess in the blood has to come out of the blood and into the alveolus, so that there is a space. There isn't an imbalance. There is a balance that's going on. So as oxygen seeps in, oxygen diffuses into the red blood cells, carbon dioxide at the same time diffuses out of the blood cells into the alveolar surface. See, carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveolus, and as a result of these things taking place, what happens is our blood gets oxygenated. See, the blood slowly gets oxygenated, and this blood, these capillaries, then forms small veins leading into the formation of a larger pulmonary vein, which then drains into the heart. So, from the lungs, the oxygenated blood is then drained into the heart, which then supplies this very oxygenated blood to the rest of the body. So, the walls of the capillary and the alveoli may share the same membrane. See, the distance within them is so small that they may share the same membrane. As a result, diffusion of gases is happening so efficiently that we are able to respire without feeling discomfort. So, oxygen transport, which is the main transport, or which is the main gas that needs to be transported into our body. If we were to look into detail of oxygen transport, what will we see? So guys, oxygen transport is the process through which oxygen gas is transported from the alveolus into the blood cells. Now, how does this process take place? This process is important because, as I have been repeating over and over throughout this whole chapter, that it is the gas important for respiration, and it is the gas without which our food will not be properly broken down, and none of the metabolic activity that we do, say to blink or to talk or to breathe or to do basically anything, the energy that we require will not get it. So oxygen transport is what happens within the alveolar and the capillary walls. So if you see in this diagram, you can see that in point 1, oxygen diffuses through the lung capillary wall, which means that oxygen diffuses from the alveolus to the capillaries inside the lungs, and then oxygen is carried to the tissues bound to hemoglobin. The tissues, as in the tissues that require oxygen. For example, if I had to move or blink my eyes right now, or move my lips right now in order for me to be able to talk to you guys, I need these tissues in these places, in these structures, to be able to move or to function, and they need energy. And for that energy, we need oxygen. And how is this oxygen supplied? This oxygen is carried by hemoglobin. Now, what is hemoglobin? Hemoglobin is a chemical that is made up of part heme and part globin. Heme is the Greek word that means iron. So, hemoglobin is a chemical compound that is made up of iron and the protein globin. Now, why is this molecule so important? As you can see in this diagram, that hemoglobin is the chemical that helps to bind oxygen that diffuses in the bloodstream. Now, the thing is, guys, if we didn't have a carrier molecule, hemoglobin is our carrier molecule in this instance. So if we didn't have a carrier molecule, it wouldn't be so efficient, or it wouldn't be so properly done, the gas exchange of oxygen, I mean. That which happens because of hemoglobin, because hemoglobin is kind of like the car that you take from your home, the taxi or the Uber car or the CNG or whatever that you take from your home to go to, say, from your home to the shopping mall or home to your friend's place. So if you didn't have that car, you'd probably have to walk. which is tedious, which is exhausting, and which is not as efficient as maybe going through something that properly places you from place A to place B. And hemoglobin, in case of oxygen transport, is that efficient carrier molecule, which is made up of part iron and protein globin. So, hemoglobin carries these oxygen molecules and they transport it to the tissues. And oxygen then, as a process, diffuses through the capillary walls. See, this is the basic method of the transport of oxygen. We breathe air in, air goes inside our lungs, air reaches the alveoli, wherein in those alveolar walls are on the outside of those alveolar walls are capillaries. And when the oxygen-rich environmental air and from the oxygen-rich environmental air, oxygen then seeps into the capillary walls, and carbon dioxide, which is rich in the blood capillaries, then seeps out of those capillary walls and into the alveolar wall. And when oxygen gets in, it is bound with hemoglobin. And hemoglobin, which is present in the red blood cells, and this is another important point, guys. Hemoglobin is the chemical that gives red blood cells its red color. So it's a key component of the composition of red blood cells, hemoglobin. And hemoglobin is necessary because it binds and carries oxygen. And as it does so, oxygen diffuses through the tissue capillary walls. When the red blood cells carrying oxygen and hemoglobin, the compound which is in combination known as oxyhemoglobin, it carries that to the tissue walls, and when in contact to the tissue walls, oxygen then diffuses through the tissue walls into the cells that needs it in the first place. So, this was oxygen transport. But then the question arises that what are some of the advantages? Why hemoglobin? Why couldn't it be anything else? Why couldn't just red blood cell take oxygen, put it inside? I mean, red blood cells do not have a nucleus, as we learned in the circulatory system, right? Then why doesn't red blood cell carry hemoglobin by itself in the first place? If you follow the answer in the red parts here, you'll see why. See, the adaptive adaptation. The term adaptation means to adapt yourself to your environment. So in case of hemoglobin, the adaptive advantage is that hemoglobin is like a glove, guys. One time the oxygen molecule binds to it, it changes its shape slightly so that it can allow the second oxygen molecule to bind properly than the first one did. And then the third one will bind much better than the second one did, and so on and on and on. So the adaptive advantage of hemoglobin is that it allows oxygen molecules to bind more properly than its previous one. And as you can see, the attachment of the first molecule makes it easier for the second molecule, and so on. Also, another advantage is if oxygen molecules were to dissolve in the blood plasma and then they were transported, the amount that could have been transported in that process is much lower than that is transported via the oxyhemoglobin complex. So, in oxygen transport, we learn that oxygen from the environmental air crosses through the alveoli into the blood capillaries, wherein the oxygen molecule binds with the hemoglobin molecule present in the red blood cells and forms the oxyhemoglobin complex. And this oxyhemoglobin molecule is then carried via the red blood cells to the cells or the tissues that are in need of oxygen in the first place. And when the oxyhemoglobin complex comes in contact or within the vicinity, oxygen diffuses into the tissues, and thereby oxygen transport happens so much properly, so efficiently. And then we have hemoglobin, which is an iron protein complex, and the important of it is that it is such a proper, such a workable, and my favorite word, efficient carrier, that it changes its shape like a glove each and every time it binds with the oxygen molecule, making it easier for the next molecule to bind to it properly. And then the amount that could be transported via the oxyhemoglobin complex is much higher than that if it were transported via the blood plasma. After the transport of oxygen, the next gas that needs to be discussed is carbon dioxide. So right now we are going to discuss about the transport of carbon dioxide. As you can see in the diagram, that most carbon dioxide is transported as they are dissolved in the blood plasma. So about 70% of the carbon dioxide that is expelled out of the body or is transported in the form of bicarbonate ions. As you can see in here, this is the symbol of the bicarbonate ion. And some carbon dioxide binds with hemoglobin in the same way that oxygen molecules did, and they form this complex known as carboxyhemoglobin, which is then also transported, but that amount is lesser than that of the amount of carbon dioxide that is carried as bicarbonate ions. So if we look into this diagram, we see that carbon dioxide diffuses through tissue capillary walls. If we go back into our previous discussion, as oxygen is seeping in, carbon dioxide is seeping out. So we said that we learned that oxygen from the alveolar sac seeps through the alveolar epithelium and into the capillary endothelial cell, wherein it combines with the hemoglobin in the red blood cells. But when it comes to carbon dioxide, what happens is that carbon dioxide diffuses through tissue capillary wall, and then carbon dioxide is carried to the lung. So carbon dioxide from our body cells diffuses through tissue capillary walls and into the bloodstream. And in the bloodstream, in the blood plasma, it combines and forms bicarbonate ions. And through the flow of the blood, it is transported to lungs. Inside the lungs, the carbon dioxide diffuses through the lung capillary wall into the alveolar air sacs. So, if I have to repeat myself for you to understand properly, guys, see, I do this a lot of times, and if it annoys you, I'm really sorry, but I want to help you to understand these topics as much as I can. So I'm going to repeat myself for your understanding one more time, which is that in our cells or in the tissue where carbon dioxide is present and it needs to be transported out, carbon dioxide diffuses through the tissue capillary walls into the bloodstream, and in the bloodstream it combines with the blood plasma, forms the bicarbonate ions, and in this form carbon dioxide is transported into the lungs. In the lungs, the carbon dioxide then breaks down into the gaseous form and it diffuses through the lung capillary walls into the alveolar air sacs, and in the form of the process we know as expiration, we breathe out carbon dioxide. So that was the process of carbon dioxide transport. So next up is the topic of circulation and gas exchange. As you can see in the slide, that gas exchange at the lungs and in the body cells move oxygen into the cells and carbon dioxide out. This is what we learned so far. So in here you can see that the circulation of blood and gas exchange in a summarized diagram. See, this is our heart. This is the right side of the heart and this is the left side of the heart. In the chapter The Circulatory System, we learned that the right side of the heart mainly pumps deoxygenated blood which comes from the body, and on the left side of the heart we have the oxygenated blood coming from the respiratory system, coming from the lungs to the heart, which is then pumped throughout the body. So this diagram that you have on your screens right now is a summarized explanation of this process. So in here you see gases move in and out of the lungs by breathing. We breathe in and out and we take gases in, some gases get in and some gases go out. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged in the lung by diffusion. So oxygen gets in our body by diffusion, and at the same time, by the same process, carbon dioxide gets out of our body. Something that we have discussed in detail so far. And then gases that are dissolved in the blood, that is oxygen that is dissolved in the blood, are transported by the circulatory system. How does that happen? Oxygen that is dissolved in the blood, in the red blood cells via the molecule hemoglobin, forming oxyhemoglobin, is then transported via the pulmonary vein to the heart, which then supplies that oxygenated blood throughout the body like this. And so oxygenated blood and oxygen in whole is transported via the circulatory system. In here, you can see that the left atrium pumps the oxygenated blood to the body cell. This is a mass of body cells, this is a tissue. In the body cells, oxygen then seeps in, and from there, from the tissues or from the body cells, carbon dioxide that is produced because of oxygen seeping in and performing cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is produced as a byproduct, and carbon dioxide then seeps out of these body cells, of these tissues, into the bloodstream. And then they are carried out by the veins, and this deoxygenated blood, or blood that is higher in concentration of carbon dioxide, is passed through these veins into the right atrium of the heart. In the right atrium, the blood is then pumped into the ventricle, which is then squeezed via the pulmonary artery to the lungs, where gas exchange happens again. And this process is happening so many times each and every second that we live that we don't even pay attention. But even if some of it stopped or some of it was hampered, we would probably die, which is pretty scary if you think about it. Now, if we were to look into some questions which are fashioned on the topics that we have discussed so far, I hope that you will be able to answer them before I supply the answer to you myself. So let's dig in. What happens when you breathe in? See, the rib muscles, they relax, the diaphragm contracts, air leaves the alveoli, and air moves between the chest wall and the lung. So out of these four options, what do you think happens when we breathe in? So the answer is, when we breathe in, the diaphragm contracts. See, the rib muscles do not relax when we breathe in. From part 1, if you have paid attention, when we breathe in, the rib muscles contract. And air does not leave the alveoli. Air enters the alveoli when we breathe in. Nor does the air move between the chest muscle and the lungs. That does not happen, guys. So the only option there was the diaphragm contracts. Let's look into another question. Diffusion of oxygen from lungs to blood is rapid because active transport moves oxygen, hemoglobin takes up oxygen keeping plasma concentration low, or blood plasma is oxygen rich. So diffusion of oxygen to blood is rapid because of what? Which one of these points? Yes. So the answer is hemoglobin takes up oxygen, which keeps the plasma concentration low, because active transport does not move oxygen. Oxygen seeps in because of diffusion. And blood plasma is oxygen rich. No, blood plasma is carbon dioxide rich. So hemoglobin takes up oxygen, keeping plasma concentration low. Next up, we have most of the oxygen in the blood is in the white blood cells, or bound to hemoglobin, or combined with carbon to make carbon dioxide, or dissolved in the plasma. So which one is it? Most of the oxygen in blood is bound to hemoglobin. It is not present in the white blood cells, which we know is important for the immune functions. It is not combined to make carbon dioxide, because carbon dioxide in itself is a gas that is produced as a byproduct of cellular respiration. And it's not dissolved in plasma, because dissolved in plasma is carbon dioxide forming the bicarbonate ions. So the only explanation is that most of the oxygen in our blood is bound to hemoglobin. So guys, this was the end of part 2 of the chapter, the respiratory system. In this chapter, we discussed gaseous exchange in whole, the transport of oxygen, the transport of carbon dioxide, the role of circulatory system in gaseous exchange, what alveoli is, and why are they so efficient in gaseous exchange, and why oxygen and carbon dioxide are important gases to be exchanged throughout our respiratory system. And up until part 3 comes along, have a nice day.